Good morning, church. It's such a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Like Roger said, he asked me last night to preach, but it wasn't just last night. It was on the way out the door to Thomas and Tiffany's rehearsal. But thankfully, this past week, I was on a mission trip with some teenagers from my church in Louisville. Like Roger said, I'm a student at Southern Seminary in Louisville. I work as a family minister there, so I basically take care of anybody who's got a family. So that's my job at Parkland. And so this last week we took our teenagers to Dayton, Ohio, which is where my dad's church is. We stayed there and did some mission work with about 9 different churches over this past week. And one of the churches had a block party one night, so they invited me to come and share with their children. I could share any story that I wanted to. So that's kind of dangerous, giving me an open invitation to do that. But the story that kept coming back to mind was the story that we're going to talk about today. So after I shared that story, I told one of my friends who was with me, I said, you know what, that'll preach. That'll preach. I'm scheduled to preach next Sunday at my church in Louisville as well. So I figured let's just go ahead and get a jump start on this because I'm really fired up about this story, all right? No pun intended. So if you will, turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3 is where we're going to spend our time today. And because it's such a long section, such a long chapter, we're going to take it in little pieces, all right? So as we get to a different part, then we're going to talk about it. We'll read the little section, and then we'll move on, all right? But before we get there, have you guys ever noticed the commercials for medications that they have on TV? You notice those like prescription medication commercials that they have out there? They say, if you have this problem, you should take this medicine, right? But then at the end, they list all the possible side effects for the medicine. I've always wondered why on earth they want to do that on TV, because some of those side effects make you think, do I really want to take this medicine? I have a list here of a couple that I thought were kind of funny. First one, they say you could be nauseous when you take this medicine. You could have a rash or hives. You could have trouble breathing. Your hands and feet can swell. You could have heart problems. You could have blurry vision, things like that. So I always wonder, why on earth do they want to tell us these things? Why would somebody willingly take that medication knowing what the side effects are going to be? And for us, we know that we take that medication because the benefit outweighs those risks. We know that if you have that certain medical problem, that the benefits are going to outweigh those risks. But we're going to see here in this passage is that obeying God tends to have side effects. There are things that happen that aren't always good when we obey God. Sometimes there are consequences for obeying God and being faithful to God. Sometimes bad things happen even when we do the right thing and we're obeying God. So that's what happens today in this story. And we're going to see that the reason that we obey God is not because good things are going to happen in return, though they do. God does bless us when we obey Him. But we obey God because He has told us to obey Him. Because it's the right thing to do. Okay? So let's look at this. Let's look at this text. And we're going to see 4 different things here. So before we get there, I want to give you a little context about this chapter here, because we can't go back and read all the stuff that leads up to this, because that would take hours and hours, and we got a wedding to go to. But the context of this passage is that Israel is in captivity in Babylon. All right? So Babylon was kind of like the big bully on the block. They were coming around taking over nations, kidnapping people, and bringing them back to Babylon. So the guys in this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were captured from Israel, taken back to Babylon because they were healthy, they were smart young men. All right? And the king wanted to train them up in the Babylonian way. So he wanted them to eat the food that came from his table. He wanted them to learn to be advisors and rulers in Babylon. But we see in chapter 1 of Daniel that they refused to follow the king, and they chose to follow God instead. And what happens is they end up being better advisors, better looking, healthier than all these other guys who did what the king told them to do. And so we're going to see here that in the beginning of chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar has built a golden altar of himself and placed it outside where his people can see it, all right? So I don't know what kind of egomaniac King Nebuchadnezzar was, but he must have been that guy who walked by the mirror and stopped and said, yeah, that's King Nebuchadnezzar, because he built a golden statue of himself that he wanted the people to worship. So every time they heard this certain music in the kingdom, they had to stop and they had to worship at this golden idol that he had built of himself. Okay? So that's the context that we see for this passage. So we're going to see 4 different things. The first thing is this, is that we need to obey God even when nobody else is. We need to obey God even when nobody else is. So let's look at verse 4 here. Daniel 3 and verse 4. And this is where the king is giving his decree about what the people are supposed to do. And it says this, "And the herald proclaimed aloud, 'You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Now let's jump down to verse 12, and it says this. There are certain Jews. This is the advisors coming back and reporting to the king what the people are actually doing, all right? They basically are saying, everybody is doing the right thing. And then they come to verse 12 and it says, "But there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you, and they do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So we see in that first little passage that he gives this decree, and it says that all the people, nations, languages, everybody was falling down and worshiping at this statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, except for these 3 guys. All right? It's basically giving us the impression that they were standing on their own because they knew it was wrong to worship an idol. All right? It's in direct violation of the 10 Commandments. Back in Exodus 20. We see that God says, "You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make any idols for yourselves." That's like 1 and 2. That's basic Jewish law right there. That's the basics. If you don't know that part, you don't really know the rest of it, right? So we see that it's in violation of these basic laws that they've known since they were children. The reason they were taken captive to Babylon is because they were usually educated, they were smart, they were well off. So they know the law. They know what God has told them to do. And so for them to stand up and say, "We're going to do this," despite the fact that everybody else is bowing down, is incredible. We don't really worship carved idols anymore. It's not really a common practice in the United States. But I think we do worship several other things that aren't God, and we put them in front of Him on a consistent basis. So some of those things could be money, possessions, power, sex, sports. We worship entertainment. We worship convenience. We worship speed of getting things done. We worship a lot of things that aren't God. And even though the whole world is worshiping those things, we need to be the kind of people that say, "No, I choose to worship God before anything else." Not just when it's convenient or when it's easy, but when nobody else around me is doing the right thing. When nobody else around me is doing the right thing. That's the kind of obedience that we see here from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As Christians, we are called to live differently than the rest of the world. We're called to be holy and set apart. And I don't see any greater example of being set apart than these guys. The nations around them are worshiping King Nebuchadnezzar, and these 3 are standing alone. So that's the first thing, that we need to obey God even when nobody else is. The second thing, let's jump to verse 13. Jump to verse 13 with me. And we're going to see that we have to obey God even though we're going to face hardship. Obey God even though we're going to face hardship. It says this, after King Nebuchadnezzar had heard about what was going on, he said this. It says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to him, 'Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?'" Okay, So Nebuchadnezzar finds out what they're doing. He finds out that they're following the Jewish laws and they're only worshiping God instead of worshiping him. And he is mad. It says that he's in furious rage. I don't know if you've ever known somebody to be in a furious rage before, but that's got to be pretty terrifying. The king is in a furious rage, right? So somebody's going to die when the king is in a furious rage. Somebody is getting killed when the king's in a furious rage. So that's what they come into. He comes and he questions them and says, don't you know the rule? I told you this is what you were supposed to do. I built this idol. It probably cost him a lot of money because it was made out of gold. And so he's like, I want you to worship this. I told you what to do, and you're not doing it. So he threatens them and basically says, I'm gonna throw you in a fire if you don't worship my idol. I'm going to throw you into this burning fire if you don't do that. So we see that they're willing not just to be set apart and to not worship the idol, but they're willing to face that punishment. All right? It's not that they didn't worship the king and then they ran away and tried to get back to Israel. They stayed there and they went before the king and they answered to him. And it's a great answer. Get ready for that part. That's coming up next. But they answered him. And so I think they were willing to sacrifice their very lives to obey God. They're willing to sacrifice their very lives to obey God. What we've seen in a lot of churches, I've had a chance to work with a lot of churches on a short-term basis and also now in Louisville on a long-term basis. What we see is that a lot of Christians are unwilling to sacrifice things in their life for God, right? They're willing to come to church. They're willing to be a part of the Bible study. They're willing to do this, that, and the other. But as long as it doesn't interfere with the rest of my life. It's sort of like, the example I give to teenagers is, anybody ever play with Legos when you were a kid? I loved Legos when I was a kid. My brother and I had a giant bucket of Legos, and we used to build all kinds of crazy things. So in Legos, there's a piece that are sort of large and flat, and you build things on top of it. All right? And that's what God is supposed to be like in our lives. We're supposed to build our lives on God. He's supposed to be the foundation. The basis of our life is supposed to be that flat piece on the bottom. But what we try to do is we try to build our life, our little Legos, and then we try to take a tiny little piece and stick him on top. You say, yeah, I got God. Look, he's right on top here. Instead of tearing down and demolishing what we've already built and starting over with that foundation of God, we try to just add him on the top. And that's not the kind of obedience and the kind of faith that we're called to in Scripture. That's not the obedience and faith that we see in Scripture. What we're seeing here, especially from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is they're willing to give up everything in order to follow God and to obey God. In college, I was a psychology major. So basically, I asked a lot of questions about how does that make you feel? So I was a psychology major, and there's an experiment in psychology that they call the marshmallow experiment. You do this with little kids, all right? And it's supposed to teach them to delayed gratification, all right? So what you do is this, is you take in a bag of marshmallows or whatever kind of treat that your kid likes, and you have the whole bag of them, right? And so you sit one out on the table in front of them and say, I'll be back in 10 minutes. You can have that marshmallow now, or you can wait 10 minutes and I'll give you the whole bag. So some kids try to cover up the marshmallow so they don't have to look at it. Some kids try to take a little nap so they don't have to look at the marshmallow or think about it. Some kids do different things, but some kids take that marshmallow and eat it. And when you get back, you say, okay, you got your marshmallow. I'm going to take this bag and I'm going to keep it. But the kids who persevere get the whole bag. They get the whole bag of treats. I think as Christians, we end up worrying too much about the one marshmallow that's in front of us right now that we forget that God has the whole bag. That there's this little bitty life that we have in front of us. This little, it says it's like a mist. It's just a breath. It's here for a second and then it's gone. We have this little tiny little bitty life that's in front of us, and we're so worried about that little marshmallow that's sitting on the table that we forget that God has abundant, eternal, forever and ever and ever life in heaven for us. And we sacrifice that whole bag of marshmallows for this little one that's sitting on the table. And so the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are giving us such an example here that they considered the one marshmallow on the table to be nothing in comparison with obeying God and the whole bag that's going to come eventually. So that's the kind of obedience we have to have. An obedience to God even though we know we're going to face hardship. Now, your hardship may not be being thrown into a fiery furnace, and I sure hope it's not, because that is a pretty harsh punishment. He's going to burn these guys up. But maybe your hardship is going to be losing a friendship, Or maybe it's losing a bad habit that you have that is ungodly and sinful and you know it, but you're not willing to give that over to him. Maybe that's what you're going to lose when you obey God. But those losses are nothing in comparison with the reward that we have with God in eternity. Those sacrifices that we make now are nothing in comparison with eternity. So that's the next thing we see, is that first we saw that when we obey God even when no one else will. Second is that we obey God even though we're going to face hardship. And now this is where it really starts to get good, is that we obey God because it's right. We obey God because it's right. These are some of my favorite verses in the Old Testament, so they always get me a little excited. So let's read these verses. Verse 16 says this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. That's an incredible reply. So remember we said the king was in furious rage. Somebody's getting ready to die. That's the answer they gave to the king in the furious rage when somebody's about to die. They basically said, I don't have to answer you because God's going to deliver me. And even if he doesn't, I still won't worship you. That's their reply to the king who's in furious rage. That is ridiculous. How stupid do you have to be? He already told you he's going to throw you into a fiery furnace, and that's the answer you gave to him. It wasn't, oh, I'm sorry, king, I didn't hear the music. I forgot that I was supposed to worship, so maybe next time. That's not the answer they gave him. They didn't apologize. They said, we don't have to answer you. And even if we don't get delivered, we're not going to serve you. That's the answer that they give. So we obey God because it's the right thing to do. We obey God because it's right. Not because God's going to give us a reward. Not because God's going to keep bad things away from us. But because it's the right thing to do. Somewhere along the line in Christianity, we've gotten away from the gospel. We've gotten away from what Scripture says. We think that if I do this, then God's required to do this for me. If I go to church, then God's required to give me good things in my life. If I tithe, then God's required to give me blessings. If I do this, then God is required to do something in return. But that is a completely backwards way of thinking. All right? We don't have a works-based faith. We're not. A good example of this is I was a troublemaker as a kid. I know it's shocking. Basically, I didn't know when to stop talking. So that was kind of my biggest problem. So in kindergarten, we had these little things called tallies. So when we get in trouble, you got to go put a little tally in your little pocket. And, mom and dad were always disappointed. You got a little tally or whatever. So one time I got a tally for leading a nap time revolt. Another time I got tallies for thinking that steam was smoke and shouting fire and getting everybody out of the building. So I was kind of a troublemaker as a kindergarten. So eventually I had so much trouble that my parents were tried to bribe me. All right. So basically they said, if you go a whole week without getting a tally, then we'll go get ice cream or we'll go get a candy bar or we'll go get something nice that you like. So that worked for a while, right? But eventually, when I got tired of the candy bar, ice cream, whatever, then I went back to just doing whatever I always did. And I was getting tallies and getting in trouble, the whole thing. So that's kind of how we treat God, though. We say, all right, God, if you do this for me, then I'll do something back for you. But that's not how the gospel works. It's not how the gospel works. We don't realize that God has already done so much for us that we don't need him to do anything else. If God only sent Jesus to die for our sins so we can have eternal life, we're good. That should be enough for us. But we try to add all these things on top of it. It's kind of like when kids go to an ice cream sundae bar and there's all those toppings and stuff, and they just I got to get all this stuff. So they keep trying to pile on top of it. And you're like, you already got ice cream. It's already got candy in it. God has already given us so much that if he never gave us another blessing for the rest of our lives, that should be enough for us. That should be enough for us. But that's not how we treat God. We treat God as if I do something, you're going to do something back for me. And a lot of times when we do obey God, he is going to bless us. But that's not the reason why we obey him. We obey him because it's the right thing to do, because he's told us that we need to obey him. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They obeyed God because God told him to obey. Because God told them to obey. So we're not obeying God because we're looking for a reward. We're not obeying God for that. A lot of times in church associational life, people try to volunteer for leadership positions. And my dad and others that I talk to always say, you don't want the guy in leadership who always is jumping up saying, ooh, pick me, pick me, pick me. Because that's the guy who is doing it because he wants to be in control, wants to be in power. You want the guy who's reluctant to lead your thing, because then he's going to be humble and he's going to do a good job. And so a lot of times we do that. We do that with God. We jump up and say, oh, God, bless me, bless me, bless me, bless me. And instead of doing the right thing and obeying him, we're just looking for those rewards that he's going to give us instead. So that's the third thing we see, is that we obey God because it's the right thing to do. So let's look at the end of this. What happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Let's look at verse 24. So, king filled with fury, furious rage, he threatens to throw them into a fiery furnace. And he gets so angry at that reply. I mean, and wouldn't you if you're the king? I would be furious if that was the answer that I got back as the king. So what he does is he tells them to heat up the fiery furnace to a million, bajillion, gazillion degrees. So they turn this bad boy up as fast as they can. It is boiling lava hot. This thing is smoking. I mean, it's literally, it is burning up. It says it is so hot that the guards who opened the door to toss them in got consumed by the fire. Okay? So this thing is cooking. And in verse 24 it says this. It says, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. So they throw them into the fire, bound up, all 3 of them. He looks inside to see, how are they doing? Are they getting nice and toasted? And what he sees is he sees 4 men in there walking around, not bound up, walking around. Most of us have been camping, and we've all done that part where we kind of catch the marshmallow on fire, and it gets all crispy and burned up. And especially kids, they like to catch them on fire just because the fire's fun. And so they catch them on fire and they get all crispy. That's what he was expecting to see, all right? He was expecting to see, he tossed these guys in there. They're going to be crispy, crunchy. They're going to be, extra crispy. They're going to be well done. They're going to be gone, toasted up to nothing. And what he sees is he sees them walking around in the fire. They're just sort of like chilling, walking around in the fire. And they're not really burned and nothing really bad's happening to them. And so obviously that would be pretty astonishing, right? That's pretty astonishing. And not only does he see 3, but he sees 4. He sees 4 people in there. And what I want us to see with this last part is that when we obey God, he's going to show up and stand with us. That God will stand with you when you obey him. God will stand with you when you obey him. Often we have to face consequences of doing the right thing. It feels like a lot of times we wish that when we do the right thing, that good things should happen back to us. But that's not always how it works. A lot of times when we do the right things, we lose friendships. We lose sometimes a job. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's your time. Sometimes it's just different things. We lose something sometimes when we do the right thing. But those things that we give up are not worth comparing to what we get back. And that's that God is going to stand with us when we are obedient to him. When I was a kid, I kind of had trouble learning how to swim. I was kind of just flailing when I was in the water. I would just be all over the place. And so my dad, when I was first learning to swim, he would stand in the pool and I would jump out and I would make sure that he was there and I would swim to him. A lot of times, we're afraid to jump into the water when we're kids because we don't know what's going to happen. We feel like we can't swim. We're not very confident in ourselves to swim by ourselves. Just knowing that my dad was right there, that he was going to catch me in case I was going under, was enough to make me jump in. Was enough to help me to know I could jump in. I knew he was going to be there for me if I needed him. And I think that's what we need to see with our faith, is that when we take a leap of faith, when we step out on faith and obey God, that he's going to be there to catch us when we go under, because we've been obedient to him. So God is there to stand with us when we are obedient to him. God is there to stand with us when we are obedient to him. And at the end of this story, it says that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they come out. He basically calls in and he says, hey, come on out here. And they walk out, and it says they didn't even smell like fire. You guys have ever been around a campfire? You know, fire has a distinct smell. When I was in high school, we used to go over to my friend's house all the time. We would do little bonfires and stuff. And when we left, we always smelled like that smoke that comes up from those bonfires. It says they didn't even smell like fire. So that fire didn't touch them at all, basically. Basically, they just walked in and walked straight back out of this burning hot, fiery furnace. And that's because they were willing to obey God, not because they were going to get a reward, not because they were expecting to avoid the fiery furnace, but because they did it because it was the right thing to do. They obeyed God because it was the right thing to do. And that's the thing that we're faced with today. So as we wrap up here, let's look back to some of these. We obey God even when nobody else will. We obey God even though we face hardship. We obey God because it's right. And finally, we obey God because he will stand with us. So as we close now, I want everybody to bow your head and close your eyes with me, because I think there's a really strong challenge in here from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When we have that kind of example of obedience, it should call us to question our own obedience. So my question to you is this: is there an area of your life where you are not being obedient to God? Maybe it's in how you handle your finances. Maybe it's a specific sin that you found has been a habit for years. It may be something completely different. But is there an area of your life where you are not being obedient to God? The second question is this: Are you afraid of what obedience may cost you? Are you afraid of what that obedience may cost you? So my challenge to you is this, as we have this time of prayer, is to ask God to show you areas in your life where you are not in total obedience to him. And then ask him to help you give them over in complete surrender to him. Not because you're expecting a reward, not because we're expecting something good to happen, but because we're obeying him because it's the right thing to do.